Hello, and I hope this message finds you well. I'm going to release a presentation on something I've been thinking about for years now, ever since the Star Wars sequels came out, and that is how to rewrite those sequels. I'm going to be approaching this from a fairly large-scale philosophical vantage rather than dealing with the minutia of the plot and characters, because that's not really what I'm interested in. So this first slide details that. It says that I'm really interested in the philosophical ideas at heart of the original Star Wars films. I mean, the first trilogy and the prequel trilogy, the films by George Lucas, and then how the Disney trilogy might have expanded upon those ideas in a meaningful way. Um, I'm not interested in bashing the sequels. That has been done to death. Indeed, I believe we live in a time where the Star Wars franchise as a whole is on its last legs. And so, yeah, it's just not interesting, not my style to slam these movies in that way. So in order to understand, for me, the essence of Star Wars, we need to talk about what the Force is. And I have a photo of Yoda here because Yoda is our vehicle in the original trilogy for understanding the Force. You know, he's modeled after a sage or a guru, a mystic, and especially in Empire Strikes Back, he talks with Luke about what the Force is and how it works. So I'm thinking about the scene where he salvages Luke's X-Wing from the bog. What does Yoda say? He says that the Force connects and binds us. So it's some sort of invisible web among human beings. Um, that within the framework of the Force, we are luminous beings, not this crude matter. And he's touching Luke's arm. He's saying, this isn't what you really are. So there's some idea of a soul or something beyond incarnation. And he says it's a powerful ally. And again, Yoda is able to, it's one of the most famous moments in all of film. He's able to rescue the X-Wing for Luke despite his diminutive size in comparison to that X-Wing, because Yoda is using the Force. Um, from elsewhere in the original Star Wars trilogy, here are some additional things we learn. One of them I'll harp on more later. The Force allows us to commune with beings who have passed on. So there is the phenomenon of Force ghosts in Star Wars. Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon are two of the most prominent instances. Um, and George Lucas would also talk about this quite a bit in interviews. There is a dark side to the Force. The dark side might, in the short term, breed greater physical powers, but in the long run, it's toxic to us, both mentally and physically. You can see this because Palpatine and Vader, who were two of the people most in the thrall of the dark side within the main story, they're sickly. Palpatine is ugly, his face is deformed, Vader is half machine. And of course, we get to the dark side through so-called negative emotions. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, all of that. So, distilling all of this, the original trilogy presents the Force as something like the void from Buddhism. So, that's this abyss from which all phenomena arise. It's the 0 point of creation. Or we might also see it as the nominal or soul realm. So, it is objective reality, absolute reality. We can tap into the Force in order to harness creative powers, but if we are trying to mold it to our own will too much, which is what the dark side represents, then we abuse it, and in turn, we are damaged. Now, the prequel trilogy complicates these notions in some ways that I'll touch on briefly. Um, in the prequel trilogy, the Force is more scientific, whereas in the original trilogy, it's more mystical or spiritual. So in the prequels, we learn about midi-chlorians, which are these microscopic beings that live in people's bodies, and midi-chlorians allow us to tap into the Force. We learn that Anakin has an off-the-charts midi-chlorian count. And so there are pros and cons to this conceptual invention. I wrote here, well, the original trilogy's incarnation of the Force comes across as democratic and spiritual, that is, anyone can access it. The prequel trilogy's rendition feels more aristocratic and individualistic. So there's more of a sense of being born into a chosen lineage that has Force powers, and being a Skywalker or a Palpatine is a choice example of that. So yeah, it gets away from, I would argue, the original trilogy's notion that this could be accessible to anyone, right? Even someone like Han Solo theoretically could learn to tap into the Force. Nevertheless, for me, this is, if we really boil everything down, this is the principal emotional arc of Star Wars that I'm about to lay out. And these are the George Lucas films, so the Star Wars universe as it existed prior to the sequel trilogy, the Disney trilogy. Um, Anakin Skywalker is highly force sensitive. He has the midi-chlorian count. Of course, he's also an analog for Jesus because it's said that his mother is the Force. So, or sorry, his father is the Force. So there's an immaculate conception there. Um, he is afraid of losing his wife, which is totally sensible within his worldview. And that's because he's lost his mother and he doesn't want to experience that loss a second time. This fear makes him manipulable to Palpatine, who becomes the Emperor. And so Palpatine warps Anakin's mind and turns him into Darth Vader, right? Then the original trilogy. We have Anakin's son, Luke Skywalker. He is trained by both Yoda and Obi-Wan. They beseech him to kill Vader because they believe that the dark side is irredeemable. But importantly, Luke doesn't listen to them. In Return of the Jedi, he appeals to the good that he sees still living in his father. And ultimately, this converts Vader back into Anakin, back to the light side, and Anakin saves Luke in that final encounter with the Emperor by throwing the Emperor down the chamber. This is all prior to the somehow Palpatine return stuff. Um, and of course, governing all of this is the notion of the prophecy that Anakin is prophesied to bring balance to the Force, which he does in that moment when he saves Luke. Um, okay, now another piece of this, which is evident in this whole sequence, if we think about it, is that in the original six films, especially in the prequels, but in the sequels as well, or sorry, in the original trilogy as well, there is a flaw in the Jedi Order, which is that the Jedis have turned the Force into this dogmatism, which is sort of like spiritual bypassing. It's the dogmatism of only positive emotions all the time, seeing everything as ephemeral, non-attachment, um, an unwillingness to invest in or be changed by life in a way. And from this lens, we see that the Jedi Order actually sows its own defeat by virtue of the way they treat Anakin. Anakin is just a child, he's been separated from his mother, then his mother dies, and they basically shun him and they inculcate in him this attitude of stoicism. So he's taught to suppress these highly vital emotions that anyone would have in this situation. And because of this, Palpatine is able to entice Anakin because Palpatine is sympathetic to him. He sees him and he honors his emotions. Um, Notoriously, Anakin goes to Yoda and tells him about this prophetic dream he's had that Padme will die in childbirth. He veils it so he's not disclosing that he's actually with Padme because he's supposed to be celibate. And Yoda essentially says, just let it go. Don't worry about it, which isn't great advice in that situation. I also wrote here, and this is critical, kind of the proof in the pudding on this matter is that who becomes the most valiant and noble Jedi in Star Wars? Luke, and he's the one who has the least training. That impulse in him to still honor the good and bring forth the good and see someone else as redeemable is something that Yoda and Obi-Wan explicitly tell him is wrong, right? And I just want to acknowledge much of the thinking on this slide is indebted to a pop culture detective video, which is called The Case Against the Jedi Order. He talks about sort of toxic masculinity, the way the Jedis operate from that, and the effects that this has on Anakin in the prequel trilogy. So, this is all building up to I wanted to talk about the sequel trilogy. Here for me is the missed opportunity of the sequel trilogy. I think the most interesting component of that trilogy, and I know people have a lot of issues with this movie. It's actually the only movie in the sequel trilogy that I like. But in The Last Jedi, we meet Luke again, and he has failed a student, and that student has turned to the dark side. I think that's a really interesting idea. Luke, although he was our hero in the previous trilogy, he would grow and he wouldn't be flawless. And it is sort of a component of aging that often aging mentors become stuck in their ways, right? So he could fall prey to the same kind of dogmatism that dooms the Jedi in the prequel trilogy. Um, was there something else I was going to say here? I don't think so. Um, Yeah, so I think a more satisfying ending to the Disney trilogy then would have been for Luke to ultimately come to the same conclusions that I've talked about previously in this presentation. He makes this mistake with a student. It could be Kylo Ren. I like that relationship. And then through self-inquiry or working with Han and Leia or whatever, he recognizes oh, there's this impulse to brand certain emotions as negative or bad and to be a stoic in life. And that's actually a kind of cutting oneself off from life energy, which is the force. And it's my doing that as a teacher, which sowed this evil in my student, right? Because I didn't allow that student to be fully expressed. Um, and this could even provide Luke kind of a catharsis about what happened to his father, how his father fell prey to the dark side. He goes, oh, my father had the same kind of mentors as I was to Kylo Ren, and that's why he turned out the way he did, and I now have an opportunity to right that wrong. It gives Luke an opportunity to be the hero again, but it's in a more subtle and philosophical manner as opposed to just swinging a lightsaber at the bad guys, which we've seen multiple times. I feel what's interesting about this is, again, it provides reflection on and distills meaning from the prequel trilogy in a way that the existing sequel trilogy does not. Additionally, it's more, as I said in the previous slide, subtle or philosophical. It has perhaps Luke ultimately realizing that this dogmatic or restrictive way of teaching is what creates villains, and that through doing away with the strict binary between light and dark side of the force through embracing sort of non-dualism, um, there might not be a need for Jedi in the same way anyway, right? Because there might not be Sith anymore. So it could have a sense of like a denouement to the entire series and to this sort of philosophical capstone as opposed to, yeah, just more lightsaber wielding. Um, as a final thought, George Lucas has always said that the Star Wars films are for children. But I think these films, the sequels, were an opportunity for the films to grow and to attain nuance as their primary audiences had grown as well. And there's precedent for that. If you think of the brilliance of like Toy Story 3, Toy Story 3 meets the children who were raised on Toy Story 1 at the time that those children are going off to college, and the character has grown with them. So the sequel trilogy could have done the same thing. So those are my thoughts on this matter. I'm sure I'm treading old ground here because so many people have um, picked apart these films in far more brutal ways, I think, than I did. But yeah, these are just some thoughts I've had ever since I watched the Star Wars sequel trilogy about the missed opportunity as far as a commentary on the spiritual aspects of the Force and the appropriate attitudes there toward. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a blessed day. Goodbye.